This is Mr. Shea, Notre Dame High School, Chapter 17, American Pageant for AP United States History. We start with the election of William Henry Harrison, a Whig who has the distinction of serving the shortest term in American history, just 4 months in office. And that was due to contracting pneumonia probably during his longest inaugural speech in American history, his other distinction, which he gave in the cold, damp day. Harrison election is significant, however, because because of his death, crushed the plans of the Whig Party. Here's the Whig Party having William Henry Harrison elected, putting in place really the puppet masters of Harrison at this time. Daniel Webster, Secretary of the State, and Henry Clay, spokesman of the Senate, who no question was the leader of the Whig Party, who both believed they'd be able to control uh, Harrison in the office, and not that Harrison needed too much controlling. He believed in the Whig principles of the platform, but clearly they were in control. But with Harrison's death and John Tyler's ascension to the presidency, things changed drastically. Remember, many times vice presidents are chosen to get votes. So here is John Tyler, a former Democrat, a Southerner, who was chosen just for that reason, because they believed, and they were right to believe it, that he would garner some of those Southern votes for William Henry Harrison. So when John Tyler takes over, it's considered to be a victory really for the Democrats. At first, they weren't sure if he truly were still a Democrat, and the Whigs weren't sure if he was really a Whig, and so there was a question here of who John Tyler really was politically, but it's going to play out fairly quickly. So, what is the Whig Party platform? It's pro-bank. If we think the Whigs to back to the Federalist Party in the late 1700s, we think Alexander Hamilton, pro-national bank, pro-tariff policy, pro-internal improvement. So these types of policies, revenue generating, protecting manufacturers, especially in New England, improving the United States infrastructure through the building of canals and railroads, and using the bank as the primary funding piece for all of these actions. Tyler was not politically in favor of many of these policies, and he's going to be challenged early on to see if he's going to support his party or go with his own political beliefs, which certainly have their roots in the Democratic Party. Interesting here, and you can see on the screen that Harrison, who was elected, served only 4 weeks, where Tyler, his vice president, served 204 weeks. So certainly the Whigs did not get what they wanted, even though they won the election. Early on, the Whigs, of course, the Whig Congress also, the Whigs won in Congress a majority in the election as well. They quickly passed a law ending the independent treasury system. So the idea of the treasury system being independent of the national government, it's their form of conducting business on the federal level, whereas the Whigs wanted that controlled by an actual central national bank. So very different theories there. It seems like that it's not too different, but it is very different. One being independent of the federal government, the other one being connected to the federal government. Um, so Tyler doesn't agree with it, but he does pass it. Okay, so at this point, Tyler seems to be conciliatory, seems to be loyal to his party, his newly found party, and is certainly bashed in the South as being a Northern sympathizer or a Whig sympathizer, very unpopular in places where he would normally garner votes. Of course, then Tyler pushes through, or Clay decides on pushing through a new bank, following up the dismantling of the Treasury. He really doesn't run it by Tyler at all, doesn't look for his support, his approval, and Tyler resents this strongly. And as a result, he vetoes the bill. The Whigs tried again and changed it slightly to create a different structure to the federal bank, but Tyler again vetoes it. Now, at this point, the Democrats realize what they have in Tyler. They have an ally. They see that Tyler is still loyal to his original Democratic roots, and they are excited. The Whigs know at this point that they've really been betrayed. Here they are. They won the presidential election. They had a mandate from the people to govern on their promises, which included a lot of the items that Tyler was now vetoing, and they were outraged by it. They formally expelled him from their party. This is that's a major thing. Imagine if the Democrats formally expelled President Obama from their party. So this was significant. His entire cabinet resigns except for Webster. Again, this is pretty unprecedented, but it's what happens when a vice president is chosen just to acquire votes and who may not be really loyal to the actual party, the ticket he is running in. Okay, so the Whigs then go ahead and try to pass a tariff bill, and the tariff bill makes sense. Tariff policy protection American business, protecting American business interests. However, the bill also has in it a provision for distribution of federal revenue among the states from the sale of public lands. And Tyler sees this as overstepping the constitutionality quite a bit, sees it as the federal government overstepping its power and its boundaries, and he vetoes that bill as well. The Whigs respond with another tariff bill. They remove the dollar distribution portion of the bill out, and Tyler reluctantly signs into law the tariff of 1842. But you can see the constant struggle between the Whigs, who believed they had a presidential candidate or president who they were going to be able to count on to pass through all of their legislation, to now dealing with a complete adversary in the executive branch, which they never would have dreamed would have been the case. So what's going on with Britain during this time? The War of 1812, clearly long past, but still tensions with Great Britain in different places. Not only, you think of Great Britain, you say, well, why would there be tensions? Well, there's still disputed territory in Canada. Not only Canada, Maine, Oregon territory, which we know now today. Think about Oregon, Washington, those areas in the Pacific Northwest that border right along the Canadian border. These areas are still disputed, and what's going to happen. And where do the anti-British passions come from? Obviously still the remnants of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the idea that the Federalists are no longer around, and they were really the British sympathizers, and then other things too. Just the war of the press, the perception that the British had of the Americans, and the way that they described or portrayed the Americans in the press angered many Americans. In addition to that, America at this time in its history is a debtor nation. In order to grow, it is borrowing money, a substantial amount. Not only the American government, but also American business, American farmers, and Britain is in such a great position financially that they're a creditor nation. And although everything's legal and it's both need each other, the Americans need the British to grow, the British need the Americans to make great loans and money off those loans, it's still a resentful relationship between a creditor and debtor, no matter what. I mean, do you think about today, and we still think today, and we say, oh my God, how many of you guys have heard a conversation say, geez, how much do we owe China? How much of that debt is owed to China? And you get this like negative connotation of China for some reason, as if China is doing something wrong by lending us the money that we're asking for. But that sense of, resentment or, wherever that comes from, why don't we just invade China and not pay our debts? You hear people say silly things like that. And you heard people say it then too. It was the same relationship. But in 1837, when several of the states actually default as a result of an economic panic, several states default on a lot of their loans and refuse to pay them altogether. And this is really an unfair action taken against the British lenders, and creates more of or increased tension between British and Americans. So then, we have various outbreaks of fighting. One of the first ones happens in Canada, where you have a really, it says short-lived insurrection, but you have two sides, smaller groups fighting. Washington is trying, this small groups of British and Americans fighting. Washington's policy of neutrality and not pursuing any kind of war action is pretty stout. They don't want to get involved with this, but it does continue to escalate, and then eventually the incident with the Caroline. Occurs. And again, this is an American steamer that's carrying supplies to these rebels in Canada, which is sunk, probably legally by the British, but it happens, close to American territory. Only one American dies, but it does inflame Americans. And the idea of the British on American soil taking American life, even though only one American sailor was actually killed, upsets many Americans. And it's something that at this time, America really, even though it's upset, is not ready to go to war and really has brought it upon itself. Individual in 1840 named McLeod in a tavern, who knows if he was involved or wasn't involved, confesses to being involved in the Caroline incident. He's arrested. The British say if he is executed, there would be a full-scale war. Luckily, he had an alibi, and he was acquitted. It avoided that possible confrontation. In 1841, British officials granted asylum to 130 Virginian slaves when they captured an American ship, the Creole. This outraged a lot of Southern farmers. Also worried then that they would lose their allies there. Remember, Britain had abolished slavery and no longer was a slave nation, so things had changed drastically from that standpoint. So the Southerners are nervous about the possibility that the British will get involved in their Caribbean possessions and would alter the slave trade altogether. This is just a picture showing, what the British thought of the Americans, and it's a cartoon that kind of portrays the stereotypes and the prejudices that existed during the time. Okay, so actual official happenings in Maine between the British and the Americans, the Maine boundary dispute. The St. Lawrence River, because it's icebound such a long period of time during the year, the British wanted a westward road from the Halifax seaport right to Quebec, but for them that road would go through disputed territory in Maine. So they needed that land in order to create this road, which they believed was necessary for their national interest. At first, America really kind of ignores it, but within the territory, between Americans who were in that territory and the British who were in that territory, fighting breaks out in the Aroostook War, and it threatens a full scale war. Luckily, Lord Ashburton was sent by the British to the United States, and his relationship with Secretary Webster was very good, and they finally came to some compromise on the Maine boundary. And really, the Americans gained quite a bit more square miles, including, which you don't see here, there's probably a map that's I'll be able to show you guys, including territories, because the boundary extends, very wealthy or rich territories in natural resources. What do the British get? The British get the land that allows them to build that road between the Halifax seaport and Quebec. So they're happy, even though they had a lot less land, square miles. So the treaty, although the United States gave up the land that the British wanted to build the road, ultimately, as a result, the United States did very well. And you can see here this disputed territory. Here's the proposed road route that the British wanted to build. It goes through disputed Maine territory, and here is the Webster-Ashburton treaty line. And you can see what is given up by the United States is just this area right here, and what is acquired by the United States. All right, let's shift our focus to Texas for a little while. Mexico, we talked to a couple chapters ago. We understand the what happened in Texas, but this time, Mexico still refuses to recognize Texas independence. They believed it was just still a state in rebellion, and eventually they would go back and reconquer it. In order to continue with their threat, they're always threatening and sometimes sending in small raids, and the individual citizens of Texas consistently have to keep a standing army for protection. It's very expensive for them, and so what does the United States do? What do the citizens or the leaders in Texas do, to really solve this issue? Because Mexico says it would consider it an act of war if America were to annex Texas, even though they really paid little attention to it and weren't making any real signs of taking Texas back. So Texas acts as an independent nation. They signed treaties with France, Holland, and Belgium, and this really put a lot of fear in the government, the United States, because here's Texas, so close to the United States, so especially the southern interests, the hope of expanding the Texas, the lost revenue that Texas could generate. The idea of having an enemy so close, bordering the United States, would give them entry point. And Britain saw all these risks, or these risks that the United States saw, and wanted to take advantage. Britain certainly had an interest in independent Texas and allying itself with them. And so the United States, although it took its time, nearly a decade, began to move towards, and this is just kind of repeating a lot of what I just said, what British saw as appealing, the idea of British abolitionists. They wanted a shot at Texas to keep from the spread of slavery, put a free country right next to the slave-holding states. British merchants wanted an opportunity to get into a tariff-free zone and really trade and expand their markets. And British manufacturers saw it as a good opportunity in case civil war did break out. If the South had cut off the cotton trade, they certainly had access still to this desired crop. So in 1844, in the presidential campaign, this issue of Texas becomes a primary point. There were those who were very opposed to expansion, uh, who saw the risks because of the slavery issue expanding westward, and would it be free, slave, what would the balance of power, how would it shift? But pro-expansionists, and of course then you had the southern hotheads who cried Texas or disunion. So you're already getting this idea of secession. It's already thrown out there. Here at this point, you could tell the heated debates that are growing more and more as we move closer to the Civil War. And then the pro-expansion Democrats under Polk, who finally are victorious. They win against Henry Clay here, and I don't know if I have it in there, but they win against Henry Clay, and Henry Clay had made the mistake really. I think I have this on a slide coming up, but I'll go ahead. Henry Clay really had a bad, a typical political. Remember, Henry Clay is the great compromiser, and his stance on Texas was, I think we should, personally, I believe we should annex Texas, right? But not now, down the road. So here's a great political move. He thought it was a great political move anyway, where he thought he was appealing to the South by saying he believed Texas should be annexed. However, to appeal to the North, not till much later down the road. This would cost him, which I think I will show you in a couple of slides. Tyler deserves a lot of the credit for, we say, shepherding Texas in the fold, because he didn't act too quickly. It seemed to be a very good time period to allow Mexico to act on its claims. They never did. Really was the perfect timing, and Tyler moves ahead and pushes through using a joint resolution. All that means is, instead of needing a two-third vote, he arranged for annexation by a joint resolution, which just basically means it goes to one house and needed a majority. And so Texas is formally invited in 1845 and became the 28th state of the United States. Mexico is upset. really Mexico didn't agree to what had happened, didn't uh, really confirm the annexation or grant the independence that Texas said it had, or the United States, not independence, but the adoption of the United States of Texas. Okay. So I'm just going to move on here because I kind of already talked about a lot of this. Okay, back to Oregon, and then we'll come back to um, to Texas again. Okay, we'll go back to Oregon. Another issue in the election of 1844 was Oregon, although much less of an issue. This territory had long been disputed, but the truth of it was neither the British, and of course you see the Spanish and the Russians were involved at some point. 5440 line is a line that goes all the way up to Alaska. Neither side, the British or the Americans, really cared too much about this area. You look at what were the claims they had. The British had an actual colonizing agency, the Hudson Bay Company, which did fur trade in the area. They had a lot of people who lived there compared to the Americans. Not a lot, but a decent amount. Discovery exploration. The Americans had exploration and occupation. Lewis and Clark had explored. Um, they also named the Columbia River, which Robert Gray named after a ship. So they both have claims on this area. It's really the presence of the American missionaries who stayed in this area and promoted it and let people know how great they believed it was, that led many more settlers to go there. Than eventually we're going to find out with the gold rush how many go there. Um, but eventually Americans during the 1840s, late 1830s to the mid 1840s, began to populate this area strongly south of the Columbian River, where the British, because the fur trade in that area has really been exhausted, less and less a presence. But the British continually turned down um, the idea of. I'm just trying to see here which slide I'm going on, guys. I apologize. Of dividing the territory at the 49th parallel. The British saw the Columbian River the same as they saw the St. Lawrence River, and they wanted the Columbian River on their territory, on their side. So stubbornly, they fight this 49th parallel compromise and reject it. So eventually, by the idea that when Polk runs for office in 1844, he's running on the idea that they're going to take all the Oregon Territory right up to Alaska, and this idea was championed by pro-democratic expansionists who wanted to move as far as they could. The idea of manifest destiny, all these key terms that we discussed, all champion the idea, and it sounded like a lot of bravado. However, as a result of, I'm sorry here, guys. As a result of what had happened in Texas and the idea that Texas eventually annexed, and I'm trying to skip around here, and I apologize for that. Uh, I'll come back to the Oregon Territory. But let me just finish. As a result of Texas and what was going on and the annexation of Texas, eventually the you know the charge to take all the Oregon Territory and was lost. Polk didn't have to worry about it as much, and eventually they're going to sign a treaty with Britain at the 49th parallel, which divides the Oregon Territory. So that's going to end. And eventually just be signed. It will eventually be proposed by the British, actually, and the Americans will accept it. Okay. Apologize for the PowerPoint skipping around. We go back to the election of 1844. Again, just talking about who was running. The idea of manifest destiny was a major turn this time. The idea that America was destined to spread the principles of democracy further west on the American continent, and then maybe even south, and maybe even north. And this was the term used by expansionists to justify their territorial claims as they moved forward. Henry Clay, by the way, runs again here in 1844. He's got to feel like he's just snake bit. He can't win a presidential election no matter what. And really, Henry Clay loses as a result of his idea on Texas, where he has that two-way stance, which we talked about earlier, and he loses key votes in New York. And if he had just won New York, he would have won the presidential election. And you can see here in the election, Clay accused of being the corrupt bargainer, um, a flip-flopper on his policies. The Whigs accused Polk of being a brutal slave owner. You see here they've made up lies that he had a gang of Tennessee slaves that had been on their way to Southern Market, branded with the initials JKP for James K. Polk. That was made up. But ultimately, Polk wins in a narrow victory. Again, you see here in New York, losing New York by just 5,000 votes. Remember, you lose a state just by 5,000 votes, you lose all of those electoral votes. So if New York had gone to Polk, then it would have turned the election to Clay. But Clay, in his always compromising spirit and his policy on Texas, had lost the Liberty Party there and those 16,000 votes, which ultimately cost him the election. So once Polk wins, the Democrats feel like they have a mandate to take Texas officially. Remember, Tyler had already signed into law, what was going on, but now they had a real political thrust to move forward with the annexation, which they will do. You guys can take a look at these: Manifest Destiny, picture painting. Okay, so who was President Polk? You could read, about him, his personality and who he was and everything else. But he did have a 4-point program, and he did achieve this for them. Well, all presidents have an idea of what am I going to do? I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. He lays out 4 points in this program, and he's going to accomplish all of them in less than 4 years. So regardless if people agreed with his 4-point program, he did what he said he was going to do, which was impressive to many at the time. One of the parts of his program was to lower the tariff. He does this very early. They reduce the tariff from 32 to 25%. The Walker tariff bill makes it through Congress. It's criticized by New Englanders, but it proved to be very beneficial to all because with a lower tariff, it opens up markets, and New Englanders who opposed it really benefited a great deal from it. He restores the independent treasury. Remember that the pro-bank Whigs were very much opposed to this. They would like we go back to that idea of a federal bank connected to the federal government, and so Polk brings back an independent treasury. That was point number 2. 3 and 4 were tougher. He had to settle the disputes of the Oregon Territory, which I've already talked to you guys about. I know there's a few slides coming up again about it, but we'll just kind of gloss over those. So he did that without any bloodshed. And although he would not gain all the Oregon territories he promised, nobody really minded what he did and the deal he made with Great Britain, since no blood was shed. The biggest hurdle for him was the acquisition of California. California was sought after. The valleys of California, everybody knew that it had great potential. Gold would soon be found there, but not very soon, actually. But the idea that it was very fertile ground, and people just saw the possibility. So his 4th promise was the acquisition of California. I'm going to skip over this, guys. This is the Oregon dispute again. I'll stay on the slides here just for a second so you can take a look. If you want to read these, you could just pause the PowerPoint. Then we jump back to the tariff here. And there's the compromise line of 1846, the 49th parallel. Okay, so how does Polk go about getting California from Mexico? Well, he's got a couple bad things to deal with here against him. One, the Americans, had about $3 million of claims that they had won or they believed were owed to American citizens from the Mexican government. The Mexican government disputed these, did not want to pay it. In addition to that, the strained relations between the United States as a result of Texas annexation put a very, bad taste in the Mexicans' mouth, and they were not willing to do business with them. Polk could wait for the Americans in California to lead an uprising like they did in Texas, but that would take a long time. He'd have to be patient. It was very possible he would not be president once that happened. So he looks to buy Texas from Mexico and use money to solve the dispute. In Texas, Mexico wanted the southern border, so now Mexico really negotiating, well, what border is going to divide Texas and Mexico. And although Texas is still upset about giving up Texas, Mexico is still upset about giving Texas. Period. The Nueces River boundary was what they believed was the appropriate boundary, and where the Texans, those individuals living in Texas, believed that the Rio Grande should be the southern boundary, which would give them more territory. Polk was always very careful to keep American troops out of this no man's land, this gray area zone, so that no war would break out. Then Polk hears rumors that Britain wants to get involved in buying California, and this makes him extremely anxious that the British want to get a foothold, a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but also a situation where, uh, here is your rival now trying to gain that very desired land, and it's your fourth point you promised in your campaign, and so really wants to avoid that if at all possible. So Polk sends John Slidell to Mexico City to offer $25 million for California territory to the east. Mexico would not even meet with Slidell. This is a terrible defeat for Polk at the time, and now he was left with really no option. So what's he going to do to acquire this territory? So Polk goes a different route. Polk is going to attempt to provoke war. He does this by ordering 4,000 men into that before mentioned gray area, that no man's land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, hoping that fighting would break out and the Mexicans would fire first. They don't initially, and Polk is so impatient that on May 9th, 1846, he proposed to declare war based on unpaid claims and Slidell's rejection. These are really, really inadequate reasons for a country to go to war. There's no question that these two reasons alone are very imperialistic. But as fortune would have it for Polk, the Mexicans actually do enter into no man's land and do fire upon the American troops on that exact night, and bloodshed has now been spilled, and the Mexican troops were the first to fire. And at this point, Polk has the merits, the impetus to act and get Congress to act. So he sends his war message to Congress. Congress passes the declaration of war. Abraham Lincoln is given the nickname Spotty Lincoln during this time because he tries to gets past the spot resolution. He wants to see he wants proof of exactly where American blood was shed on American soil. So he is very skeptical of what Polk has just done. He sees what's going on, and he's kind of just making a political statement. Okay, so did Polk provoke war? Absolutely. But were the Mexicans willing to fight at the same breath? Absolutely. Both sides had, this idea of moral indignation, moral righteousness. The Mexicans believed that the American giant from the north was invading. The Americans believed that the Mexicans were inciting a war and that they had the right to these lands. So both sides were kind of irking for a war. Just little plot, although significant. Santa Anna, an expelled leader from Mexico, former leader of Mexico, makes a deal with Polk for Polk to send him some money and gain him access back into Mexico, and he would betray his people or at least negotiate a peace settlement and give Polk everything that he desired from the war. He betrays him immediately. Santa Anna goes, raises an army, and raises his defenses. Everything that the Americans did during the Mexican War was extremely successful from a military perspective. whether it's Kearney in California and Fremont further in the west, and then into California, easily winning victory after victory, creating the short-lived California Beer Flag Republic. If you ever wonder why California's state flag has the bear, or their school, University of California, Berkeley, mascot of the Bears, this is where it comes from. Zachary Taylor, really with 5,000 troops, was able to capture 20,000 troops under Santa Ana. The Mexicans at this point are really defeated. Once he reaches Buena Vista, he becomes a war hero. It's going to certainly help him in his future presidential victory, being such a war hero in the Mexican War. However, he couldn't really push through by himself. He had exhausted his supplies and his really positive momentum. He needed some help. Winfield Scott provides this. He works his way up to Mexico City in 1847 with limited resources. Really, one of the more brilliant campaigns during the time, and established himself as the most decorated general in the Mexican War. Here's the map, and again, you guys can pause and take a look at yourself. A lot of the things that we've discussed here, whether it's Fremont or Kearney, Field Scott. Okay, you just get a sense of where all these battles are taking place, and where the fighting is happening. So at this point, once the Mexican army is trapped in Mexico City, Scott and Chief Clerk of the State Department, Nicholas Trist, who's sent by Polk to negotiate with Santa Anna, and he's pays $10,000 to have like a ceasefire and get to talk to Santa Anna. Santa Anna kind of is stalling and going back on his word over and over again. Polk wants Trist to come home. Trist refuses in a 65-page letter, and then quickly negotiates with Santa Anna the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, February 2nd. This treaty is extremely impactful. For the United States acquires half of what was Mexico at the time, more territory than what was acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. Keeps some kind of, whether it's the United States says, it keeps on a moral high ground. The United States agrees to wipe out the debts owed to them, the $3.25 million, and pay $15 million for this land. So Mexico can at least have something in return for this lost territory. And at this point, Polk had to get this pushed through. He pushed it through pretty hard because he realized that the Senate was growing more and more agitated with the war, especially those anti-expansionists, those Whigs who believed that this war was wrong, and if he lost funding for the war from Congress, then they would lose the war and lose their advantage. He also saw the danger in the pro-expansionists who were clamoring for conquering all of Mexico, which would create a whole set of policing issues, political issues, how to do that. It would have been too expensive and dangerous for the United States at the time. So eventually, 18.25 million is the total cost. The United States only loses, I say only loses, but 13,000 American lives, mostly by disease. It's a lot of people, but considering how much territory is gained and the fruits of the Mexican War, really not too much. When you think about what's going to be lost in the Civil War, this is very minimal. Also, a lot of the generals in the Civil War gained their political experience during this time. I mean, their military experience during this time. The Navy, really establishes itself during this war with a successful blockade, and also the United States Army gains quite a bit of prestige or respect around the world as other countries realize that the United States military is a formidable force growing year after year in strength and size. So that's certainly significant. There you have the Marine Corps won new laurels, and this day sings it in it, stirring hymn about the halls of Montezuma. So, you get an idea of the significance of a war that really did not have a huge expense of life and was fought flawlessly by the Americans. Right towards the end of the war, the Wilmot Proviso is passed by David Wilmot. It never actually passed, excuse me, but never becomes a federal law. And really, what it would stated was any territory gained from Mexico would be slavery would be banned. Uh, Although it never passed, it symbolizes the growing distrust between northern and southern politicians and the fight that's going to occur uh, in Congress moving forward from this point on. Some photos again, guys. You could pause any of these and read them in your book. Take a look. Okay, that's chapter 17. Good luck.